In 1899, the then relatively unknown Anglican clergyman and fellow of Hertford College, Oxford, W.R. Inge, published his first book, Christian Mysticism. It was an expanded version of the Bampton Lectures, which he had given earlier that year in Oxford. No one could perhaps have guessed the impact that Inge's work would have. It heralded and tapped into a revival of interest in mysticism and the broader subject of religious experience in Britain and beyond. The book was very well received. It went into 7 editions, and it cultivated an interest in mysticism amongst the, I would say, middle-class reading public, and thereby demonstrated to the publishing industry that this was a lucrative area for the future. There followed in quick succession many books on the topic. Some became classics, most obviously Underhill's Mysticism, but also von Hugel's book, The Mystical Element in Religion, and many others. I could go on giving a long list, but I won't. Inge himself wrote, reviewing Underhill's short book, The Mystic Way, in the Times Literary Supplement in 1913, to those who can observe the signs of the time and the deeper currents of contemporary thought, nothing appears more significant than the rapid increase of interest in mysticism, which means the religion of direct personal experience. Books on mysticism are now pouring from the press, and some of them are sold by the thousand. At the end of his life, he was looking back and wrote of his own first book on the subject, Christian Mysticism, as a book which I venture to think had some influence on turning the attention of the religious public to the subject. So this morning I want to look at 4 people involved in this revival of interest in early 20th century Britain and its empire. The first 2 are probably well known to you. They are W.R. Inge and Evelyn Underhill, key figures. I think Underhill, the more I do this work, the more I think Underhill is the key figure. I'm creating a digital humanities project on spiritual networks between 1890 and about the beginning of the Second World War, and the person who everyone is connected to is Underhill. It's really extraordinary. So I shall look at their personal interest on the subject and why their own quests opened up questions that might lead to some kind of comparative work, even though that was not their primary interest. And then I'm going to look at 2 much less well-known figures, Margaret Smith and Verrier Elwin. Some people may have heard of Margaret Smith, yeah? Sufism. What about Verrier Elwin? Oh, that's excellent. No one's heard of him. Great. They both had a personal interest in mysticism, ignited by the work of Inge and Underhill, and in each case in their context, they were working in parts of the British Empire in the interwar years. That led to their consideration of the mysticism of different traditions, Sufism in the case of Smith, and Indian thought, Hinduism in the case of Elwin. And I think and I hope that although this very much historical paper comes at the end of the conference, it may echo some of the questions that have been asked all along about comparative work. So let me turn first to Inge. In his diary, he says, I'm going to try and give the Bamptons. You have to apply to give the Bamptons because I'm nobody and I need to make my mark. And he did make his mark, actually. The book established his intellectual reputation. He went on to be the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Cambridge, and then he became, in 1911, the Dean of St Paul's Cathedral, a position he held until he retired in 1934, and from which he had a huge platform to speak. But I think his interest in mysticism was actually very sincere, despite what he wrote in his diary. And it was long-lasting. The very last book he wrote, Mysticism and Religion, was obviously on the topic in 1948, 6 years before he died. His interest was informed by his own intellectual and spiritual needs, as he declared in the preface to Christian Mysticism. He was attracted to the mystical writers, he wrote, in the hope of finding in their writings a philosophy and a rule of life which would satisfy my mind and my conscience. Inge wrote a diary all his life, and you can read through the many volumes in Magdalen College, Cambridge archives. And he committed many aspects of his interior life to the diary, not least his depression, which was real, and feelings of failure, his ambitions, his hopes. But he wrote almost nothing about his spiritual practices and beliefs, interestingly. So we have to rely on the retrospective musings of Inge as an older man for a sense of why he turned to mysticism. And it's in his 1934 book, Vale, however you like to pronounce the Latin, which he wrote when he retired from St Paul's, that he said he had never had what he usually thought were called mystical experiences, but he had felt that he had no choice but to study religious philosophy and the writings of the mystics. This was because when he looked into the foundations of belief, he saw that the traditional authorities of church and Bible had been questioned, and thus the center of gravity in religion has shifted in our day from authority to experience. He thought that to ascribe infallibility to the pronouncements of the institutional church seems almost monstrous, and he couldn't ally himself with the Roman Catholics or the Anglo-Catholics. But he wrote, "It was equally impossible for me to ally myself with those who held that the Bible is the religion of Protestants. The biblical writers," he said, "never claimed verbal inerrancy. It was the church that drew up the canon." So the question of authority in an intellectual climate that had in recent decades had to grapple with both Darwin and biblical criticism was really at the heart of Inge's spiritual and intellectual quest. And mysticism was his answer to this question about the locus of authority. He saw it as the essence of religion with its path towards union with God, bypassing all human institutions. He gave his definition of mysticism early on in the first Bampton lecture. Mysticism has its origins in that which is the raw material of all religion, and perhaps of all philosophy and art as well, namely that dim consciousness of the beyond which is part of our nature as human beings. Religious mysticism could be understood, he said, as the attempt to realize in thought and feeling the immanence of the temporal in the eternal and the eternal in the temporal. So clearly he believed, he's like William James in this, although he didn't like James's work, that we have some inherent capacity to tap into the divine. And so his definition of mysticism makes the individual's apprehension of the beyond central to human nature, and God's part on the other side of that apprehension essential. He presented three conditions for this apprehension of the beyond, or mystic faith. First, there is a human organ that discerns that which is beyond, that's the soul. Secondly, God is already working in human beings, which means we can apprehend the divine. We could not even begin to work out our own salvation if God were not already working in us, he says. The incarnation and its correlate, that God is made in the image and likeness of human beings in Christ, and therefore humans are made in the image and likeness of God, is central to his theology and to how we can know God. Influenced by Plotinus and the Gospel of John, I think Plotinus more than the Gospel of John, but I don't know. He believed that man, in order to know God, must be a partaker of the divine nature. Thirdly, he thought human behavior has its own role. Holiness helps us to see God. Selfishness stops us seeing things that are of God. So love is important. Or, as he quotes from the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Just as a side role, some of you will know the work of, very little discussed these days, the work of Kenneth Kirk, who wrote a book called The Vision of God, an important book, also the Bampton Lectures, many years later. And he really, it's that sentence from the Beatitudes that he takes from Inge's work and develops. Inge was always skeptical about religious experiences, and he wrote much later in his life, "In truth, the typical mystical experience is just prayer." Nevertheless, he took seriously the work of the mystic and wrote that the life aim of the mystic is to be transformed into the likeness of him in whose image he was created. Complete union with God meant for Inge seeing the world as God sees it, not as we see it, for human vision is distorted by sin and ignorance. So as we go up the ladder, the traditional ladder of prayer, our ideas about God and the world will increasingly correspond with reality with a capital R. Inge's interest in prayer was as a route to spiritual truth, not purely as a practice. So we can see here, obviously, the huge influence of Neoplatonism, especially Plotinus, on Inge's thought, and indeed he made the claim, the bold claim, that Christian mysticism appears in history largely as an intellectual movement, the foster child of Platonic idealism. By declaring mysticism the raw material of all religion then, and experience the locus of authority for religion, Inge, the establishment man of our quartet, and the establishment man who was so bored by corporate worship that during services at St. Paul's Cathedral he read a book in his stall. When he went to the coronation in 11, I guess, right? Just after he'd become the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, he described the 6 hours in Westminster Abbey as a criminal waste of time. So he is very interested in this direct, so he's an establishment man, but it's really this direct relationship between God and the human being that's central for him. And institutional religion, though he's a part of it, is something he's trying in a way to bypass because all its claims to authority have been challenged. So you can see that by his definitions of mysticism, he was potentially opening up the possibility of a comparative study of the subject, though that was not really his interest. Okay, secondly, Evelyn Underhill. Her Mysticism was the other great book on the topic, I think, in this pre-World War I era. She was, at the time she wrote it, a spiritual seeker, and I think entirely representative of her times in that. She had been briefly a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, an occult group that people like Yeats belonged to. She was attracted to Roman Catholicism, but put off by the condemnation of modernism. So I don't want to go into all the debates about secularization, but I because they're so long and boring, but I think this is a moment when clearly church-going declines. Certainly, certainly it steadies out at the beginning of the 20th century, and by the 1920s, there's a waning of public religious practice. We know that statistically. But there were plenty of seekers, both inside and outside the churches. And I'm not including the numbers of those belonging to other religions, because they're very small. But obviously some of those are on the rise. You know, Buddhism is being introduced, so the number of Buddhist groups grows through the 1920s considerably. So Underhill was outside, or at least on the margins of any church when she wrote Mysticism. And during these years, the first and second decades of the 20th century, she came to have an increasing interest in other religious traditions, all the while continuing to engage especially with those who were agnostic or seeking in the way that she was and interested in spirituality. She became friends with the writer Rabindranath Tagore, whom she met in London in 1913. That was the year he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. She learnt a lot about mysticism of his tradition from him, and with him she edited the Sufi poet Kabir. She was also very close to people like the novelist May Sinclair, who they shared a love of sailing, but also swapped manuscripts to read. And someone like Sinclair resembled this kind of seeker of the period. She rejected the stifling Christianity of her youth, but nevertheless had a deep interest in the spiritual, which you can see in her novels. Although Underhill's understanding of mysticism was developing, the mystic way, as she expanded it in the books she wrote in these years before she returned to the Church of England, was largely a very individual endeavour. The emphasis was on individual prayer, meditation, and personal asceticism. After the success of mysticism, she wrote two much shorter books for seekers like herself, The Mystic Way and Practical Christianity, the latter written on the cusp of World War I, when there was still, at least among some, a sense that a new age was dawning for religion. The book was directed towards the ordinary person, though some people might say the ordinary middle-class person. It attempted to show that mysticism was not an esoteric pastime for the few, but within the grasp of all. She wrote, "It is to a practical mysticism that the practical man," she does say man, "is here invited, to a training of his latent faculties, a bracing and brightening of his languid consciousness, an emancipation from the fetters of appearance, a turning of his attention to new levels of the world." How would this happen? Through an educative process, a drill. If a person could learn how to practice the law or be good at business, so they could learn the mystic way. Nevertheless, she wrote, "This new undertaking will involve the development and training of a layer of your consciousness which has lain fallow in the past, the acquirement of a method you have never used before. The education of the mystical self lies in self-simplification." So the emphasis in practical mysticism is on the cultivation of a holy life as a private enterprise. Nowhere in the book does she ever mention church-going or corporate worship. But she perceived a need and she addressed it. She later regarded the book as incomplete because of its inattention to institutional and social spirituality. And later in life, she always wrote to her spiritual directees, "I'm a bit of a bore about you go to church. You should do it, because I held out against it for so long." Underhill understood mysticism, as Inge did, as the essence of religion. She wrote in Mysticism, the expression of the innate she wrote of it as the expression of the innate tendency of the human spirit towards complete harmony with the transcendental order. The end point was mystic union, and that end might be called the God of Christianity, The World Soul of Pantheism, the Absolute Philosophy. When she was writing Mysticism, she was completely steeped in the Christian tradition, and you will know, many of you will have read the book, and you will know that she particularly appeals to the medieval mystics of the West. And yet she also made certain editorial cuts and choices that indicated a desire to reach out to those who were not in the church. Writing to Marjorie Robinson, one of her early spiritual directees, who also translated some of the German mystics for her as she was writing the book, she indicated how she wanted Robinson to select passages for inclusion in the book. Quote, "I want most passages in mystical rather than definitely Christian language, i.e. references by name to our Lord, the Blessed Virgin, etc., or bits flavoured with scraps of scripture aren't much good. But those in which the same things are called the eternal, the all, the divine, lover, etc., will be useful." She continued, "The book is not going to be explicitly theological, as I want to make a synthesis of the doctrine of Christian and non-Christian mystics, so no over-beliefs are admissible." In other words, as the religiously ruthless author of mysticism, though she was clearly working out of the Christian context, Underhill implicitly worked with a kind of universal model of mysticism, everything's the same really, that denied the particularity of a tradition, hence the request for the erasure of definitely Christian language in her letter to Robinson. In 1921, 10 years after she published Mysticism, Underhill became a member of the Church of England most decidedly. And the range of topics about which she wrote expanded after that. But in an essay of 1936, titled "What is Mysticism?", we have a sense of what the mature Underhill saw as the relationship between mysticism and Christian mysticism, as she had made the distinction a quarter of a century earlier. So she wrote, "The beginning of an answer to the question, what is mysticism, must be this. Mysticism is the passionate longing of the soul for God, the unseen reality, loved, sought, and adored in himself or himself alone. It is, to use a favourite phrase of Baron von Hugel, a metaphysical thirst," to go back to Jessica's paper yesterday. "A mystic is not a person who practices unusual forms of prayer, but a person whose life is ruled by this thirst. He feels and responds to the overwhelming attraction of God, is sensitive to that attraction, perhaps a little in the same way as the artist is sensitive to the mysterious attraction of visible beauty and the musician to the mysterious attraction of harmonized sound." So her definition of a mystic was someone who knows that his relation to this real God takes precedence of everything else, although this Godward longing and this Godward life may be expressed in many different ways. This, she says, covers all mystics, from the impersonal ecstasy of the pagan Plotinus with his longing to attain the one, to the Christocentric passion of St. Bernard and many others. She provided examples from other religions alongside examples from Christianity. "I exist in God and am altogether his," says Rabia, the Mohammedan contemplative, who has been called the Muslim Saint Teresa. "From the beginning until the end of time, there is love between me and thee, and how shall love be extinguished?" says a Hindu. "Thou art the love wherewith the heart loves thee," says St. Augustine. "Thou dost fashion thy lovers to beauty and make them also worthy of love," says Plotinus. These she described as the typical declarations of the mystics, and she believed that it would be hard to pick out with a sure hand Christian from non-Christian in that list. But despite this, Underhill now, 1936, many years later, no longer wished to erase the particularities of Christianity. So now, in contrast with her preparations for the much earlier volume Mysticism, she wrote, "The great mystical tradition has a special quality which distinguishes it from those who have responded to the attraction of God from those who have responded to it from other faiths. The distinguishing feature of Christian mysticism is its relationship to the Incarnation, and in the great Christian mystic, something which has a certain relation to the mystery of the Incarnation takes place." What this meant was that while a non-Christian mystic such as Plotinus might, quote, "describe his ecstatic experience of God as a solitary flight from this world, with its demands, imperfections, and effusions, and a self-loss in the peace and blessedness of eternity, the Christian mystic knows these wonderful moments too, but for him they are only wonderful moments. It's the Incarnation that roots the Christian mystic with its voluntary acceptance of all the circumstances of our common situation, its ministry of healing and enlightenment, its redemptive suffering." This reiterates Underhill's suspicion of religious experience for the sake of experience, the suspicion she shared with Inge, and her emphasis on the fruits of the mystical way and the centrality of love in all things. The Christian mystic tries to continue in his own life Christ's balanced life of ceaseless communion with the Father and homely service to the crowd. Very Underhill-like language, homely service to the crowd. The particularity of Christian mysticism shouldn't surprise us, says Underhill, if, quote, the claim of Christianity to be a unique revelation of God and the claim of the Church to be a supernatural society fostering the supernatural life of the soul are true. As we'll see shortly, Verrier Elwin talks about the supernatural claims of Christianity being what marks it out. But what most of all marks out the Christian mystic is the refusal to turn away from the creatureliness of life, creation, and materiality itself. The philosophic basis of Christian mysticism is, she says, with reference to von Hugel's notion of inclusive mysticism, the doctrine of the incarnation with its continuance in the church and sacraments. Its opposite is exclusive mysticism, the attempt to ascend to the vision of God by turning away from God's creatures by an unmitigated otherworldliness. That, she says, isn't Christian at all. It ends, according to von Hugel, who of course had been her spiritual director, on whom she so often relied, in something which cannot be distinguished from mere pantheism, or, on more popular levels, in sloppy claims to be in tune with the infinite. So a bit of a sideswipe there at the spiritual but not religious. So, to sum up Inge and Underhill, both of them tapped into the questions and the quests of their time. Where did authority lie? Should we trust religious institutions, a question that became even more pressing after World War I? What is the essence of religion? And they were writing at a time when familiarity with other religions was, of course, fast increasing. In the aftermath of the First World Parliament of Religions, which had met in 1893 in Chicago, as more people had personally encountered other religious traditions throughout the British Empire, as other religions like Buddhism grew in England and of course America. So it was a moment when Inge and Underhill's specific and Christianly shaped questions about mysticism, Western questions, met knowledge of what got called the East in the work of many scholars and others working often in the field, so to speak. And my other two figures exemplify, I think, this meeting of questions and influences. So Margaret Smith, who lived from 1874 to 1970, a very long time. So in 1928, Margaret Smith, an Englishwoman, published her doctoral thesis on Verrier, a Sufi mystic of the 8th century. She died in 801. It was the first book in English on female Sufis, and an important account of the contribution of Verrier to the development of Sufism, which had been largely ignored by the main Western male scholars. When Cambridge University Press published a second edition of the book in 1984, after Smith's death, the great Harvard scholar of Sufism, Anne-Marie Schimmel, wrote an introduction to it and stated that the book in 1928 caused quite a sensation among the scholars, and to our day it has not been superseded. By the time Smith began her career in academia, she was in her 40s, and she always remained on the margins, holding short-term research fellowships at Girton in Cambridge, Manchester College in Oxford, and piecemeal teaching jobs at SOAS and other places in London, where she was largely based, eking out a living as a resident warden in a settlement house and giving private tutorials in Arabic. Her interest in mysticism grew out of her own personal Christian faith and the context of the work she'd done when she was in her 20s and 30s. After graduating from Girton, where she was an undergraduate, she joined the Church Missionary Society, one of the two main Anglican missionary societies, and we'll see that my fourth person, Elwin, is from the other, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. The CMS tends to be more evangelical, but actually she wasn't very evangelical. And she had taught in mostly girls' schools in Beirut, Damascus, and Cairo. By 1924, she was working in Khartoum and was part of the Anglican expat community there. By late that year, 1924, it was becoming dangerous to live there. Her diary has lots of examples of how she has to get down and get away from gunfire. And by May of 1925, she had left Khartoum, was back in London giving lantern slide lectures on the Muslim world, sometimes in costume, she wrote in her diary, in her capacity as a worker in the Home Department of CMS. But she clearly wanted much more. Her experience in Muslim countries had led her to study, or countries where Islam was big, had led her clearly to study Islam informally, and now she wanted to study it more formally. She enrolled for the PhD at the University of London, taught herself Persian, improved her Arabic, attended endless lectures, did research in the archives for her thesis, and often worked long into the night, often to rise early the next day for church. She was an extraordinarily disciplined person, and she continued to speak at churches about Islam, attend CMS committee meetings, pour tea at settlement house events, and cultivate her own spiritual life. She went to church daily. She was a great church hopper, dutifully recording in her diary where she had worshipped each day, tending towards broad and high churches in her personal taste. She kept a diary from a very young age to when she died, and she had a long life. And I've read these diaries, and they are almost all the same entries. I had to read them all to get the little nuggets, but basically it records where she went to church and what work she was doing. It's pretty intense. She was a very, very disciplined person. So that's her the beginnings of her academic career. In October 1928, she went to her very first retreat at Pleshy, her first retreat ever actually, and it was at Pleshy, which was the retreat house in Essex, at which Underhill loved to give retreats. It was led by Underhill, and she doesn't record the impressions of Underhill that she had, but she does summarize what Underhill said about the love of God and the meditations they engaged in. For example, 8:30, a meditation on mental prayer, an entrance into our inheritance. And until we take up our inheritance, we live only half our lives. Our inheritance is given by love, received with love, it gives us God. A month later, her book on Verrier came out. She had passed her PhD Bible in February that year. Recorded in her diary, very satisfying appearance. On December the 28th, another month later, she noted, had a good review in The Spectator by Evelyn Underhill. Underhill often became friends with the women who came to her retreats in the 20s. That's how she got to know those who were closest to her in that time, such as Margaret, her biographer. Underhill and Smith never became intimate friends, but Smith continued to attend lectures and retreats given by Underhill, and she had tea and dinner with Underhill and her husband in London from time to time. She also reviewed books for The Spectator at Underhill's invitation. Underhill was the religious books review editor. It's perhaps not surprising then that in this context of getting to know Underhill and learning from her in both retreat and lecture settings, that Smith began to work on Christian mysticism as well as Sufism. And throughout 1929, she recorded in her diary that she was working on her History of Mysticism. In 1931, this was published with SPCK this time, so a religious publisher rather than Cambridge University Press, which published her PhD, as a comparative study of Christian and Sufi mysticism under the title Studies in Early Mysticism in the Near and Middle East. She opens the book by declaring that mysticism, quote, represents a spiritual tendency which is universal, for we find it in all religions worthy of the name and in all true faiths, and is often the most vital element in such faiths. There are echoes of both Inge and Underhill, whose books are the only big surveys she includes in her bibliography, in her description of mysticism. All religious consciousness, this is a quote, is based on a realization, however dim, of a something beyond our finite ken. In mysticism, this consciousness, you can hear the language of Inge and Underhill. In mysticism, this consciousness is deepened to a sense of that beyond as a unity from which all has come, to which all things tend, and in which all things are contained. That is to say, the mystic ultimate reality, true being, is one. Like Inge and Underhill, she sees mysticism as a craving of the human soul, a thirst, and she describes it as eternal, for it's appeared at all periods of the world's history, far back in the religious teachings of India and China, in the civilizations of Greece and Rome, among Buddhists and Jews, as well as among Muslims and Christians. And like Inge in his search for an authority beyond church or sacred text, but she was much more pious than Inge, believe me, and like Inge, she sees mysticism as going beyond religion. In writing about Christian and Sufi mysticism, then, in a comparative fashion, as she did in this book, Smith faced a difficult question of influence, and we've heard quite a lot of papers in this conference about both the desirability and difficulties of how you trace influence across traditions. The difficulty here is that there was and remains a great deal of debate amongst scholars about the extent to which Sufism in that area of the world was influenced and shaped by Christian mysticism. Smith's work, both in her biography of Verrier and this book, Her Studies, addressed this question and came down on the side of Christian influence very decidedly, but without offering much, if any, evidence. Niall Green, in his recent history of Sufism, says, the main problem with such searches for traces has been that while there exists plenty of evidence for similarities and even contacts between Muslims and Christians, there exists hardly any direct evidence for the actual borrowing that is meant to have underlined the similarities. And in the first part of the book, she talks a lot about the similarities, as I'll go on to say. Even in cases where there's an evidence of borrowing, as for example in the legends about Verrier, he says, ultimately we are left with no clear understanding of how this happened. And for historians, this need for a clear explanation of how something happened is as important as the evidence that it did. Well, you can agree with that or not, but anyway. How did Smith proceed? Her first intellectual move, as we have seen, was to assume that mysticism is a practically universal tendency, an attitude of mind which has shown itself in all religions which have life within themselves, and in itself to be a spontaneous growth, note the word spontaneous, which has appeared at all ages in the world's history, in environments apparently unpromising, as well as in circumstances favourable to its nature. So she declares it's universal and spontaneous. Her second intellectual move was to make comparisons between Christian mysticism and Sufism. She looked at the development of asceticism and flowing out of that mysticism, first amongst Christians up to the 7th century and then amongst Sufis, making comparisons between the two traditions along the way. Along all the lines you might imagine, I won't go into detail about it, but basically about the celibate life, teaching on prayer, notions of God as truth, as light, as beauty, as love, and so on. From this, she makes a third intellectual move, potentially somewhat at odds with her initial notion that mysticism is both universal and spontaneous. This is an argument about influence. She suggests that Islamic mysticism would appear to have been influenced in the main by the teaching of Christian mysticism, an influence which was exerted indirectly through Orthodox Islam itself and directly through the teaching of the Christian mystics, transmitted orally by their disciples and followers or by means of their writings. In the absence of evidence, Smith assumes the influence, bringing unfortunate biases to bear on her conclusions. For example, she states that the Muslims were themselves more backward and less cultured than their Christian subjects, and so were obliged to depend upon their help and assistance in all matters for which intellectual training and a literary education were required, not least in the latter of securing teachers to educate their own children. She then suggests that Christian teachers, especially priests, were essential to Muslim education. So there's a lot of speculation here. For example, even more important than any of these contexts, perhaps, there's lots of words like perhaps in the text, was the influence of Christian women married to Muslims. So finally, she makes a fourth intellectual move, citing Neoplatonism as a common source for many, if not most, of the mystical conceptions to be found both in early Christianity and in Sufism. And it is conceivable that, please note all the italics here, my italics, that the early Sufis might have derived their mystical doctrines directly from Hellenistic sources. So, Smith's work was pioneering in many ways, not least in her study of Verrier and other female Sufis, and in her own extraordinary disciplined determination to succeed as a female academic who entered the profession late in life and entered a field that only had men in it. So, I mean, her determination was extraordinary, and the diaries, though boring, are actually very touching as well. But her work also illustrates the hazards of this early kind of comparative work, not least when a presumption of mysticism as universal and spontaneous is rather awkwardly combined with speculation about influence, which is what she does in the book. What is interesting about her approach is it doesn't allow her to write about the distinctive nature of Christian mysticism as, in fact, the other authors do. At no point, for example, does she really talk about the Incarnation as making a distinctive contribution to Christian understandings of mysticism. So, the final person, Verrier Elwin. With Verrier, V-E-R-R-I-E-R, Elwin, we come to someone who went east to India and attempted to translate Christian mysticism into the terms of the culture he was working in. As an undergraduate at Oxford in the early 1920s, Elwin, who had grown up as a narrow evangelical, had his mind and spirituality expanded by Anglo-Catholic worship, friendship with William Temple, the study of English literature, the student Christian movement, and above all else, reading both Inge and Underhill. And then he went back to other writers in the Christian mystical tradition. He studied William Law, for example, for a special paper. He met the German theologian Friedrich Heiller, whose work on prayer was to be an influence on him, though he disagreed with Heiller in some ways. He read Heiller's work on Sadhu Sundar Singh, whom he also met in Oxford. And with Haile, he discussed his growing interest in mysticism as a point of contact between Christianity and the Indian religious traditions. And around this time, he wrote a poem about his mystical quest titled The Lantern, after the Bhagavad Gita, which he published in 1926. After the Bhagavad Gita is part of the title. It was also in 1926 that he encountered the person, so he's directly working on this stuff at the same time as Smith. They're contemporaries in terms of their work, but he's younger than Smith. It was also in 1926 that he encountered the person who would encourage him to go to India and integrate these different strands of religious and mystical interest. J.C., or Jack Winslow, an Anglican priest with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel as a missionary, was on leave in Britain at the time and wanted to get young men who were priests to return to India with him. And so Elwin went after ordination as deacon and priest in Oxford and arrived in 1927 at Winslow's Christian ashram, Christa Seva Sangha, which he had set up under the influence of his mentor, C.F. Andrews, whom some people know about, to develop, quote, a true Indian expression of Christian life and worship. So the ashram morning prayer was based on the Sanskrit rising prayers of the Hindus, and evening prayer on the compline of the Jacobite Syrians of Travancore. Wow. So in this environment of, quote, Indianization, simplicity and poverty, and a great burning devotion to the peerless love of Christ, as Elwin put it in a letter to his mother, he developed his work on the relationship between Christian mysticism and the Indian tradition. Just 2 years after he arrived there in 1930, he published Christian Dhyana, kind of idea of profound meditation, which was a study of the 14th century text, The Cloud of Unknowing. So he undertook this work, he said in his preface, because he'd encountered many in India, especially Brahmins, who expressed surprise that Christianity had a mystical tradition. So he was Indianizing Christian mysticism, basically, as a way of trying to put the Christian faith into the terms of the culture he found himself in. And he later went on to talk about his work as intercultural more than interreligious. I should say that this is also a moment, so besides all these books about mysticism, this is also a moment when good critical editions of particularly the Western medieval mystical texts are being produced. So Underhill, for example, took one of the British Library manuscripts of The Cloud of Unknowing and created an edition with an introduction, and a Benedictine called Justine McCann produced one in 1924. So, these texts are circulating more widely. So, in opening this little book, it's just a little book, Elwin claimed a universal language of mysticism, while at the same time he cautioned we must beware the facile generalization that all mysticisms, even in their technique, are the same. They are akin, so he works by analogy. They speak one universal language, but the differences are no less fundamental. So, it is Elwin's context, his Indian Christian ishram, that helps situate the work. He was seeking, I think, above all, to spark a note of resonance in his readers, recognition. That's what he's aiming at throughout this text. To my non-Christian friends, I offer this account of the broad principles of the spiritual life as expounded by an ancient Christian classic, with the earnest prayer that as they read, they will recognize his teaching as something in no sense strange or alien to them, as something perhaps which will fill the deepest longing of their hearts. And he hoped his Christian readers would think it was an interesting exercise to see the cloud against the backdrop of Indian thought. In fact, he went so far as to say that the cloud itself set the precedent for this kind of experimental work precisely because it had used the terms and categories of Platonic mysticism. We might deduce from that statement that the work is not to be thought of precisely as comparative. I don't know. He plays around with this all the time. He also says, however, that such an attitude of liberal and sympathetic reverence for non-Christian spiritual experience will not be confounded with syncretism. So he doesn't want to blend things either. So he's hedging his bets throughout. So, mainly I think what he really tries to do is set up a dialectic between the universal and the particular throughout the whole book. So let me give you an example. He took, in opening the book, the cloud's central theme, that it is love rather than knowledge that enables us to know the unknowable God. And so he uses that to open up a conversation about another dialectic, the rival claims of love and knowledge, which he said was a ready subject for debate in India. The yogis, he says, thought that knowledge was the important thing, whereas members of the Bhakti school put an emphasis on love and devotion, though knowledge has, even for them, an auxiliary role washing away unbelief. Returning to the cloud, the author of which is clearly on the side of love, obviously, Elwin nevertheless points to the same debate amongst the tradition out of which that author emerged. He says, the great mystics who were his teachers had often pondered the question, inclining now to one side, now to the other. So I think his method here is primarily to demonstrate that both traditions have wrestled with the dialectic. He makes no direct comparisons at this point, nor does he make any attempt to say that one is like the other, but rather comes to separate, if analogous, conclusions about each tradition, hoping, I think, to spark some sense of recognition. In bringing his comments on the Indian writers to conclusion, he distinguishes between institutional and intellectual knowledge, and in summing up the teaching of the cloud and those of other medieval mystic writers in the author's orbit, he says, there are two eyes of the soul, reason and love. Reason will show us how wonderful God is in his creatures, but not what he is in himself. For that we must have love. So basically I'm saying he opens the book by saying, look, we've had this kind of debate and you have this kind of debate, right? It's when he turns to the question of practice that he begins to make a number of comparisons. In looking at the method of the cloud, he begins by considering its techniques for praying on their own terms. It is an ascending simplification, a gradual purification of all thought, feeling, motive, and desire. And then at some point, the cloud calls those who are fitted for it for a special form of simple, non-discursive prayer. The end of this prayer is God sought for his own sake. As Elwin comes to ask how a person called to this kind of a contemplation sets about the task, it's then that he makes comparisons with Indian practice. And describe how the cloud of forgetting needs to be put between the self and God's creatures, he describes this as a form of pratyahara, an abstraction from all things of sense, an introversion of the mind. This involves being careful to think of nothing but God. In describing this practice, then, he regards what the cloud advocates as a form of a particular Indian practice, so he implies a kind of sameness. When he moves on to what the practice does, he makes a direct comparison, beginning with a quotation from the cloud. Lift up thine heart into God with a meek stirring of love, and mean himself and none of his goods. This, he says, is true, disinterested love, which seeks the adorable for himself, with no desire for lesser things. We are not even to consider God's attributes in this, says Elwin, now quoting the Mahabharata. We must oppose the objects of sense as an elephant opposes a great stream. And finally, in trying to explain what this practice might mean, he suggests that the writing of an Indian yogi, in spite of certain expressions which a Christian theologian would not use, comes much nearer to the teaching of the cloud than those practices that speak of the cessation of vacuity of the mind. So Indian ideas about this help us understand what the cloud is trying to do more than Christian writing about it. It's not, he says, a negative self-annihilation, as Christians have said, but the great emergence of the separate personal self into the vast reality of the one infinite impersonal existence. He then finally turns to the question of Christian particularity. The type of contemplation, he writes, taught by the cloud, depends for its very technique on a certain attitude towards and belief about God and the world. Its basis of Trinitarian Christianity is not incidental to its system. It is its life, and its entire method depends upon it. So, it's in discussing the cloud and yoga, in fact, that he clarifies most sharply the distinction between Christianity and Hinduism, asking how far the Eastern mystical science approximates to the teaching of the cloud, which is the nearest thing he says there is to a Christian yoga. But there remains one great distinction, and that is between the supernatural and the supernormal, and this remains throughout. He quotes Vivekananda, there is no supernatural, he says, and he contrasts this with Christian mysticism, which claims to be and is the work of supernatural grace operating within the spirit of man. So he concludes that there are striking resemblances as mechanism, method, and ideal between yoga and the cloud, but in the end, Christianity's appeal to the supernatural will always mark it out as profoundly different. Nevertheless, he hedges his bets in the conclusion. He leaves it to the readers to discern. It is often said that all religions, especially in their mystical and esoteric elements, are the same. How far this is true, my readers must judge for themselves. We will all, however, I hope, reference our fellow travellers, he says. So you can see the moves he goes through in that many different moves in a very short book. Elwin went on to write in this way about quite a number of other Christian figures, including St. Francis of Assisi. And for a young man who'd only been in India for 2 or 3 years, his knowledge of both the Christian and Indian mystical traditions was really quite impressive. But he went on quite quickly, after about 3 years, to leave Winslow's ashram, with its purpose of giving Christianity Indian clothing, so to speak, and he expanded his work on behalf of Indians in much more radical ways. He came into contact with Gandhi and was influenced by Gandhi, and as a side note, he wrote rather an interesting article comparing Gandhi's philosophy of truth with several figures whom he called truth mystics. So in 1932, so pretty soon after he's arrived, with an Indian colleague who had studied at Mystical Theological College in England, he set up the ashram of St. Francis in the Forest, expressly to serve the Gond people who lived in extraordinary poverty. He described them as one of the victim races of the earth. His ideals had now changed. He was uninterested in writing about how Christian mysticism might be made amenable or interesting to his Indian audience, especially his non-Christian Indian audience. His ideal was now simply to serve the poorest of the poor in India and share their poverty. He became increasingly uncomfortable with any sense of the missionary. He rejected absolutely the kind of life lived by the British in India. Many in England financially supported his work, not least Evelyn Underhill very generously. They were in touch. His radical stance meant that he came into increasing conflict with the church, and the Bishop of Bombay refused to give him a license to officiate or to ordain his Indian companion, Nivali. Elwin was profoundly hurt by this, but he felt he had no choice but to resign his orders and his communicant membership of the church. He continued his work amongst the poorest of the poor for the rest of his life, and he wrote many more anthropological works. But what he regarded his work as was an outworking of the love that was at the heart of the mystical way. So he was no longer writing about mysticism. I would say he was living out the outworking of his own mystical path. His acquaintance, Evelyn Underhill, approved of what he was doing. Elwin's work stands as an instructive example of how one person was profoundly influenced by the revival of interest in mysticism in England in his youth, how he developed that in a very particular context in India to probe the question of whether mysticism is a universal phenomenon, and ultimately how he actually lived out the mystic way in service of others. Also, in conclusion, all 4 of our figures had a personal quest, so I brought their actual prayer lives, as far as I can, as far as I know about them, into this. They all had a personal spiritual quest that led them to mysticism and also shaped their intellectual questions. The work of Inge Underhill was highly influential. I don't think I can underestimate that. And Underhill's influence was not only through her books, but through her vast spiritual network and her amazing capacity for befriending people and nurturing their interest in a meaningful prayer life. So while Inge and Underhill didn't precisely address comparative work, they were writing at just the moment and in just the circumstances that such questions were being opened up and led others to pursue it. Their considerable influence, I think, makes it worthwhile to look at how they and those who followed them shaped the field we now study. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, and especially for Elwin, whom I had not heard of. I wanted to ask you about one other figure who's now forgotten, the great Auntie Underhill, Emma Herman.
Yeah.
Where does she fit into your...
I don't know where she fits in at. Where do you think she fits in? That's a great question.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting because I think she was very miffed that Underhill's book came out first.
Yeah.
And so when her book comes out, which I think is like 1918 or 1920, I can't remember exactly,
But it's at the end of the decade.
she pays homage to Underhill, but she's also quite critical throughout the course of the book. And the book was popular. It went through at least 3 or 4 editions. So it was kind of a competition. But today she's totally forgotten.
She is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough to know precisely, but I would say, to me, she fits in as someone who got pipped to the post.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
But it's an interesting book. It's really worth reading.
Yeah, no, I've read bits of it, but I should read more of it. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I should fit her into the story, yes.
I think so.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Can I ask a question about Evelyn Underhill?
There are many experts on Underhill in this room who might know more than I do.
Well, but what I was interested in was you didn't mention other forms of trying to communicate. and of course she wrote novels.
Yes.
And so I was just wondering how you understood them to fit in. Eventually she gave up the practice, but she did write quite a number.
Have you read the novels?
Some of them, yeah.
I don't think they're great novels.
No, they're not right, but I was just trying to... They're very strange stories.
Yeah, they are.
So I was wondering the content, how that content fits with...
And they are, I mean, I think they fit into I'm sure she wrote some short stories, for example, for the Horlicks magazine, Horlicks the hot drink. I think they fit into this moment of questing and seeking. I mean, she's writing some of that, but at the time she's slightly dabbling in the Order of the Golden Dawn and is friendly with people like Waite. And you know, the novels seem to me not unlike Charles Williams, even more strange novels, actually. And of course, Charles Williams carried on dabbling in this stuff. And I do say dabbling rather deliberately because I think he, you know, is sort of dabbling in it, but he's not fully in it. The way that some of this
so it's something different rather. Sorry. So it's something different rather than saying here's a version of what mysticism might look like.
I think she's searching on what the connection with the beyond, the divine, God, however you want to call it, as she would say at the beginning of mysticism. She's searching for that. And I think novels and indeed poetry, she writes some poetry too, are a way of doing that. That's how I would see it. And perhaps that's a little bit different from Charles Williams, actually, who I think was trying to be a storyteller in quite a profound way about the nature of good and evil. I don't think she's quite trying to do that, though they have equally spooky elements in them. I mean, I find that, who was I talking about Charles Williams with Jessica? I mean, I just find them very difficult to read, actually, those novels, because they're so, but they maybe tap into something, that's why I can't read them. I don't know. But I mean, I think you're right, she's trying to communicate, and she's clearly testing out what it means to be a writer. You know, what does it mean to be a polished writer? How does she do that?
I just wanted to ask a question about Underhill and ask whether you thought that Elwin, who I didn't know, is really... Well, you said she sort of changed her views. It seemed like he's living out exactly the heroic kind of Joan of Arc person that she has in mysticism.
Yes.
And I wonder, do you really think she moves away from that? Or do you think that really what she's saying in mysticism is something that she does? Because she doesn't change it, even though she edits it. She could change it, but she says, well, I'm not actually going to.
Yeah, no, I mean, it gets a little tempered, don't you think? I mean, in the letters to the spiritual directees, it gets a bit tempered, but she's always trying to. I mean, I do think commentators on Underhill are divided between saying she kind of doesn't do the mysticism thing anymore, and yes, she carries on doing it. I am in this, she carries on doing it. Half, and you're nodding, so that makes me feel great. Excellent. And I think you're right. I mean, I think the answer to the question is you're right that she does, and to me, it's very interesting that she supports Elwin financially. I mean, so does William Temple, actually. They were friends at Queen's in Oxford. So I think that is, he's living out, in a way, this ultimate sacrifice, which in the end is the fruits, which she talks about all the time. And she's doing her bit, she visits the poor for 1 afternoon a week, but that's not living in the forest with command people.
And she also thinks that Ruysbroek is the old mystic par excellence in the first book. So she's already saying that Christian mysticism in a way is the best.
Yes.
Well, she does say that as well. So I wondered just if she was really kind of, does she sort of have to say it, but she doesn't change.
I think I didn't go into this because I was trying to keep the paper brief, so I talked about this to other less well-known people, but I think you're right, that there is a tension. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. There is a tension between saying, here's mysticism and Christian mysticism is kind of best. Yes, I think you're right, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Shaw, for that wonderful exposition. Thank you, Jane. Yes. I want to ask you about Elwin and the idea that, I mean, he claimed that he didn't want to feel like a missionary, but he obviously was a missionary. And when you talk about, his grief at not being allowed to sort of ordain his assistants, presumably these assistants were sort of Christians. And I have deep problems with the idea of us going to India and sort of telling them how to save their souls when they've got a perfectly adequate method of saving their souls. And this brings me to the distinction between supernormal and supernatural, on which Elwin seems to be basing his validization of Christianity over Hinduism. Now, in what I've been researching, I've come to the idea that there's no such thing as a supernatural. and that what we think of the supernatural is actually the supernormal, so that what appears to be supernatural to us is just some sort of normality which we don't understand because of the condition we're in. And I feel that this, to maintain this distinction and then to apply it to Christianity is a sort of cultural religious imperialism. Now, I wonder what you sort of think of that.
Well, because I decided to write about a number of people, talk about a number of people this morning, I didn't give you much of Elwin, but he leaves the Winslow's ashram, which is funded by the SPG. So he leaves that funding and he goes with his one Indian companion and sets up in the forest a tiny little, you could call it, I think we'll call it a community, dedicated to St. Francis of Assisi, where he simply decides he's just going to live with the poor. That's his calling. And he, interestingly, does come into conflict, not only with, he comes into conflict with the church, as I explained, but also with Hinduism, because he's actually on the side of tribal religion. He's like, their tribal religion is fine, we don't need these other things, be it Christianity or Hinduism, right? So he has a whole kind of third thing there. And that's, a lot of his anthropological work is about this. He collects their songs and so on in a very interesting way. So I think he really does work himself out of a missionary position. It's I mean, you might say, why is he living in the middle of the forest in India? You could say that. That would be fine to say that, I think. But he thinks he's worked himself into this. He's got to a position where he thinks he's not being missionary, because he doesn't believe in converting them anymore, which is why he stops writing these books about how you might translate, medieval mystics into Hindu terms.